Welcome everybody to today's webinar on trade and climate change after COVID-19, fossil fuel subsidies, stimulus and energy prices. It's brought to you today, the webinar, by the Global Subsidies Initiative of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD. And this webinar is one of a series supported by the 9-country Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform Group. They have been working since 2010 to internationally and nationally to highlight fossil fuel subsidies which work against sustainable development and then show how they can be successfully reformed. And we will hear more from the Friends later. We have two of their representatives on the panel speaking today. My name is Peter Wooders. I'm IISD's Senior Director for Energy, and our programme's goal is to help accelerate the transition to clean energy, and this is part of IISD's broader aim to accelerate sustainable development. And our Global Subsidies Initiative, the GSI, is the key component of that work, as is our programme to support sustainable energy supplies more generally. And we're also currently populating a tracker of global energy-related stimulus and economic recovery measures, which I think will be very, very helpful for all of us going forward. And we note within that tracker whether those energy support measures are to fossil fuels, to renewables and energy efficiency, or to a mixture of all of those. We're also providing advice and information on recovery more generally to a number of countries, and thanks to support from the Pew Charitable Trusts and to UK DFID, we are supporting bringing the fishery subsidies negotiations at the WTO to a successful conclusion. And we lead from IISD's perspective on trade and climate change work, all from our base here in Geneva. So enough about us. Reflecting on the webinar earlier with a couple of colleagues, I think it's amazing to think that the first cases of COVID-19 recorded in most countries were only in January or February this year, and how much has changed since then. And I think we've all been urgently working out how we can best lessen the immediate impacts of the crisis, both locally and more globally, and then thinking more what those future impacts could be on the world around us, and again, how best we can help shape and to mitigate those impacts. And I also think most of us have been very hungry for news and for ideas too, and I hope today's webinar will help fill some of that gap. We'll focus today on trade and climate. We've all seen that this crisis has grounded airlines, it's reduced transport significantly, oil production, and so many other economic activities. And one of the big questions perhaps that still remains is, and perhaps this is an opportunity, is will the responses to this crisis and the subsequent economic recovery packages, will they put us on a different path of greenhouse gas emissions than what we were on before? Or will they lock us into an unsustainable path which will make meeting the Paris Agreement and the SDGs even more challenging than they were before the crisis? And of course, as a focus today, we will be asking specifically what can trade policy responses contribute to all that. I think also we all need examples of what has been done so far and what could be done. And we'll focus today on 3 of the key issues in the trade and climate change sphere: fossil fuel subsidies, on stimulus, and on low energy prices, which we're now seeing and which could well be with us for some time. Those prices can discourage the transition to clean energy, but of course the picture is much more complex than that, and there are many, many drivers of the way the energy sector could go as we go through the recovery and into the new economy afterwards. And also importantly, today we're going to hear about what some of the national responses have been. And after all, of course, it is national governments who have had to make the health and economic decisions that have been made so far and had to make them very, very quickly. So very important that we're going to hear from some of the national work and responses as well. And overlaying these discussions, of course, are the wider aims that countries have and the international community has around climate mitigation and adaptation, and of making our economies more circular and more resilient going forward. So the aim we have today from the webinar is an exchange of information and ideas such that the trade and climate change agenda can keep moving forward as fast as possible, both at international level and in international processes and fora, including here in Geneva and including at the WTO. We have 4 really excellent speakers for you today, who I'm sure are very well known to many of you already. We have Aiko Lim from the WTO, Ana Lizano from Costa Rica, the Costa Rican mission here in Geneva, Mike Webb from the New Zealand mission here in Geneva, and Milena Sell from Citra, the Finnish Innovation Fund. That will take us about halfway through the agenda, at which point we will move to a discussion, and Carlos van der Loo from the Canadian mission has kindly agreed to get us started as a first discussant on that. You'll see the agenda now on your screen in front of you. Please could I ask you as well, if you wish to raise comments, to ask questions, and to make interventions, please use the question and answer function, which you'll see at the bottom of the Zoom package. I don't think I need to tell anybody how to use Zoom anymore after all the weeks and months we've spent in lockdown. And we'll use that to register questions and raise those with the panelists. And thank you also to those of you who've already raised questions as part of the registration process. We have those logged. There's also a chat function in Zoom. Please use that if you wish to use raise materials or links of material things that you think could be of general interest and general use to the community here. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker today. It's Ho Lim, who's the WTO's Director for Trade and Environment and a World Authority on that agenda. Ho, it is always a pleasure and hugely informative to hear you speak, and thank you very much for agreeing to join with us today. Noting how busy you are at the WTO, including getting the Committee on Trade and Environment working generally and virtually, and other more general issues that you're pushing forward as well. So we're very interested to hear from you on your reflections on how the pandemic has affected trade, the sorts of trade measures you are seeing, including any sort of moves towards protectionism, and the screen is yours.
Thanks very much, Peter. As you an IISD seminar, and you've already outlined some of the very difficult. Oh, am I muted? No, okay. Very difficult challenges that we face. So I'll try to do my talk mainly, as you said, looking at trade and during COVID-19. Now, starting by stating the obvious, protecting people's lives, of course, is the top priority in the COVID-19 crisis. And that will continue to be the priority, I believe, for the foreseeable future. But as many of us have experienced, never have we been in a situation where national and global economies have been shut down so suddenly, nor for so long. So as this crisis continues, the economic dimensions threaten to compound the negative effects on livelihoods and health. And so going forward, how we protect lives, I believe, becomes a vital consideration as this pandemic continues. And in this sense, the sudden impact of COVID-19 on economies has been likened to that of a war, but without the damage on physical infrastructure, nor necessarily the underlying productive capacity of a country. In terms of trade, we knew that trade was already slowing down in 2019 before the virus struck. It was being weighed down by trade tensions and slowing economic growth. With COVID-19, international trade plunged as expected. And our economists, range of estimates that expect international trade to fall by between 13% to 32% in 2020. What do these figures mean? Well, behind these figures is a tremendous social and economic impact, meaning shrinking output, massive job losses, possibly rising hunger in some parts of the world, and years of hard-won development progress risk being reversed. Here, the WTO, as you already mentioned, Peter, last couple of months have been very busy. Although most staff and delegations are still working remotely, work in some ways has become more intense than before the lockdown. In terms of trade and COVID-19, on the 15th of May, the WTO General Council had a special virtual meeting to exchange views amongst members on the COVID-19 trade-related measures. On the part of the Secretariat, the Director General established an internal task force to provide transparency with respect to trade and trade-related measures taken in the context of COVID-19. The reports by the Secretariat are available on the website, should you be interested. Let me give you a very brief sort of run through on what we heard at the General Council meeting of 15 May. We heard from members of the many different policy dimensions to COVID-19 response and recovery. Many recognize that the economic dimensions of the crisis threaten, as I said earlier, to compound negative effects on livelihoods and health, and that trade, or the lack of it, can variously contribute to ameliorating problems or to aggravating the challenges in both the immediate and longer term. Many also noted that while the need for health protection of people around the world clearly remains the urgent priority, markets need to keep open in order to facilitate the flow of essential medical goods, as well as agricultural and food products. And in this light, many members did say that it was important for them to ensure that emergency measures do not have the unintended consequences of further aggravating the global economic crisis further down the road. And since then, or in the midst of the General Council meeting itself, groups of WTO members issued statements emphasizing these points. In a very rough summary, I believe what we can draw from the discussions so far at WTO in terms of trade and protection are that transparent, efficient information sharing is crucial, as new trade measures are being taken by governments nearly every day in response to COVID-19. We in the Secretariat are trying to do our best to provide that transparency, and we also appreciate the work by governments to notify their measures. Now, the other point I think that has come across quite well and quite clearly is that while WTO agreements provide flexibility to impose trade measures during an emergency, care must be taken to minimize potential impacts. Emergency measures should generally be targeted, temporary, and transparent. And there is a need to consider using the least harmful trade policy instruments in responding to the crisis. And indeed, some members have themselves taken trade facilitating measures. And another very important one is that cooperative efforts are needed to keep supply chains working, not least to ensure global availability of food and medical equipment. Now, as governments look ahead, and this is essentially the focus of the webinar, and implement the necessary policies for recovery, multilateral cooperation is indeed more important than ever. Very few, or possibly no country, can be entirely self-sufficient, or at least not do a good job at it. Trade has always played an important role in moving supplies from places where there are surpluses to those where there are deficits. And in my view, a more protectionist outlook will neither help address the COVID-19 crisis, nor will it help economies to be more resilient or sustainable in recovery. Most of you understand trade policy very well. And if you look at trade policy, protectionism has a history of protecting the status quo because established lobbies are well organized and influential. And indeed, trade protectionism in this time could slow down reform. And I think also the opportunity to build back better, as the UN Secretary General has urged. So if we look more closely at the work of trade and environment, I believe this is the time for WTO members to use the Committee on Trade and Environment to rally efforts around concrete ideas to make trade more sustainable and resilient, and align trade policies with environmental sustainability goals. It's also the time to recognize that the impact of COVID-19 is not even, and that some regions of the world will find that they're more at risk than others. And certainly more efforts are needed to help them build back better and avoid a false trade-off between immediate economic and longer-term sustainability needs. Now, On this point, I was looking recently at some work by McKinsey. According to their estimates, governments are putting together an unprecedented financial response, which already exceeds 10 trillion. And with that, the challenge will be to ensure that this response does not lead to repeat of the 2007-2008 crisis, where stimulus to the economy actually led to record high emissions in 2010. So that comes to the really big challenge. How do we find a high growth recovery formula that does not have environmental consequences, or at least have minimum environmental consequences? Now, I think how that question is answered will have an important implication on the role of trade. If governments can be convinced that they don't have to choose between economic and environmental priorities, this will be terribly important to ensure that trade policy plays a mutually supportive role. Many of you, including the IISD, are engaged in research. I would encourage you to help answer this question and demonstrate that taking into account environmental priorities is possible, and is possible without compromising economic needs. A survey cited by a McKinsey report, for instance, found more than 200 economists and economic officials agreeing that green economic recovery measures perform at least as well as non-green measures. Some go further and suggest that green economic recovery measures may even lead to better outcomes. My own very cursory reading of the research suggests that there are opportunities here to stimulate growth and create jobs, almost perhaps even doing better than what we have done in the past. Some of the stimulus measures will require replacing equipment, building new infrastructure, improving energy efficiency, for example, installing heat pumps, scaling up the use of electric vehicles, expanding renewable energy generation, and so forth. Trade will inevitably connect with these measures, not least because the technologies for sustainable recovery are to be found in goods and services which are internationally traded. Now, lowering barriers to trade in such environmental goods and services could be a part of a stimulus measure which delivers both economic and environmental returns. This, I know, is not a new idea, and it has been tried under the EGA negotiations. But conditions today, this may seem far-fetched, but I do believe that conditions today would actually make it even more urgent. This is an unprecedented crisis. Let's be creative, and I think we do have an opportunity here to turn the crisis into an unprecedented opportunity. So those are very brief words, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. And as you said, Peter, to sort of see where the opportunities might be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ho, and for really sort of laying out the agenda, I think, ahead of us a lot better than I did. And I think your key question there of how can we convince governments that a high growth recovery formula is possible with minimal environmental impact is perhaps the key question in front of us. Thank you also for putting forward some of the sectors that we might be looking into here: energy efficiency, infrastructure, electric vehicles, renewables, and also some of the potential solutions that might be available there, for example, around environmental goods and environmental services. We have a set of questions are coming in. What we will do is we'll retain those till the second half of the webinar. So I'd like to hear from all the speakers first. Those questions are going into the Q&A part at the bottom of your Zoom screens. I mistakenly said that we're using the chat function. We're not using the chat function, so please, anything in terms of materials or questions, please put them directly into the Q&A part of the Zoom. Good. So our second speaker today will also be, I think, very well known to many of you. Ana Lizano is a counsellor at the Costa Rican mission to the WTO here in Geneva, and I think even perhaps better known to you is Costa Rica has been at the forefront of sustainable development for many, many years. They were a founding member of the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform Group, and they've been continuing on the sustainable development path throughout the crisis period. Anna, we're very interested to hear more about what's been happening in Costa Rica nationally as you go about dealing with the crisis and thinking about economic recovery, but also about the Friends Advancing Sustainable Trade, the FAST group of countries who are playing a major role in advancing trade and environment at the WTO. And Costa Rica is playing a major role within that FAST group as well. So Anna, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter and IISD, for organizing this webinar. First of all, I would like to give you an overview of the Friends Advancing Sustainable Trade, and then I'll give you a short brief on what Costa Rica is doing. So the FAST group was created a little over 2 years ago with the clear premise that sustainability and trade was an issue that had been long disregarded within the WTO discussions, and somehow that needed to be included, particularly now when we are at the most critical crossroads in the history of humanity regarding climate change. Now, the group believes that trade has an important role to play in this crisis, and that issue needs to be addressed within the multilateral trading system. So, as a group of equally concerned members, we decided to go ahead and put together some language that could transmit our will to bring this discussion to the WTO. After several weeks of consultations with WTO members, giving special attention to developing countries' needs, we came up with a draft ministerial declaration on trade and environmental sustainability that we planned to launch in June at MC12. The declaration's main objective is to create an informal working group to assert the important role of trade, trade policy, and the multilateral trading system, including the WTO, in supporting the international community's efforts towards achieving the SDGs, as well as shared international environmental commitments through a forward-looking, systematic, focused, and action-oriented dialogue. We envisage that the informal working group will be able to host thematic discussions in various trade-related topics that are already on the table, such as circular economy, plastic pollution, trade and climate change, to cite a few. But most importantly, it would promote the engagement with a varied range of stakeholders, from the private sector to civil society, international organizations to academia. Our purpose is to complement the already ongoing work of the Committee on Trade and Environment and its regular activities, not duplicate. Now, life and COVID-19 had other plans, clearly. So we had to rearrange our strategy, not only for the short term and keeping the momentum we had already built, but also taking into account the profound changes the pandemic would bring to our ways of living. Society in its entirety will never be the same. And that includes the way we interact, the way we relate with nature and biodiversity, the way we obtain our natural resources, even the way we trade, as the boom in electronic commerce of the past few months has proven. So the FAST group acknowledges that this new reality has to be reflected in our initiative. So our draft declaration is still a living document in which we are working to ensure it mirrors and addresses the challenges and prospects ahead. With this, we want to be ready and better equipped for the new normality of the post-pandemic world. So what are the FAST group's perspectives for the future? Actually, they are very optimistic in this new scenario. We see that a great opportunity has opened to put solutions on the table with a heightened level of urgency, especially after experiencing the effects that the first ever global lockdown had on nature and biodiversity. The absolute need to shift to cleaner energies is clear. So is the potential of making economies greener and more circular and making better use of goods and resources. And personally, other quick wins come to my mind, that no matter how small the impact, the sum of all can weigh heavily on how we approach the climate crisis. For instance, commit to reduce emissions beginning from our inner circle, favor electric transportation, work from home, plant trees, watch consumer habits, and so on. So we have a huge chance to give trade and environmental sustainability a real shot at being on the front line of issues that can bring relief to a post-pandemic world. Our job now is to deliver this message to everyone sitting at the trade table, with two purposes mainly. First, a political purpose, aiming to expand the number of members that can support our declaration and send the message to the world that the WTO cares and that it is doing something about it. And the second purpose, which is operational, which means having that substantial mass of participants in the informal working group to effectively roll up our sleeves and get things done. Okay, so now I'm going to talk you through some of the actions that Costa Rica has been doing on the domestic level. We have been taking important actions to help with the economic recovery of our society post-pandemic. COVID-19 has hit us really, really hard in every level, and industries, MSMEs, trade, logistics, services in general, everyone is having a really hard time right now trying to get back on their feet. The government of Costa Rica has launched initiatives towards improving the sustainability and productivity of the agricultural sector, MSMEs and tourism, attraction of FDI focused on technology and well-being, among others. And on the foreign trade front, we are working intensely with our Central American counterparts to reestablish and normalize the transit of goods, having the health and safety of people as a priority. We are a small market that relies on international trade to survive, and for such reason, we have a solid FTA platform. On a post-pandemic world, more than ever, we trust that the multilateral trading system will rise to the circumstances, support its members, and lead the way against protectionism, which at this present moment can not only constrain developing countries, but also threaten food security worldwide. Trade facilitation and solidarity are key moving forward. Costa Rica has an important stance in these issues at the international scenario, as we have led by example. We are proof that sustainability is a way of living where protectionism has no say in it. Throughout our democratic history, Costa Rica has capitalized on successful policy practices. That is why we count with over 130 years of public education, almost 80 years of universal health care, more than 70 years without a standing army, 65 years generating renewable energies, 50 years promoting reforestation, more than 30 years making payments for environmental services, and more than 25 years being a nature-focused tourist destination. So today, humankind finds itself looking for answers to the present convergence of crises, both sanitary and climatic, as well as economic and energetic. Giving our forte in these four major areas, Costa Rica is participating in the High Ambition Coalition of Nations, pushing for a deal for nature. This is a United Nations multilateral forum with the firm intention to urge the international community to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals for an economic recovery that respects the natural environment. The goal of this coalition is to achieve by 2030 the conservation of at least 30% of land and marine areas worldwide. It is of the highest order of priority to secure the necessary funding for all countries to adopt as soon as possible a sustainable development model for climate action that promotes circular economy and generates well-being for all nations. As you have heard from my statement, Costa Rica has taken coherent steps at the international and multilateral level. And this pandemic has only given more leverage to these decisions. Being part of the FAST group is an example, as it is also participating in the soon-to-be-launched negotiations for an agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability with other WTO members. The President of Costa Rica has recently highlighted that the moment is now, and the exemplary Costa Rican model has proven that yes, we can generate well-being and preserve biodiversity through nature-based solutions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Anna. Just a wonderful intervention. Thank you so much. To hear that the moment is now, but also that you laid that out in the context of Costa Rica's historical commitment to sustainable development, how well it served the country, but also very interesting to hear that how hard you've been hit as a country by COVID, even with those policies in place, even with that commitment to open trade in place, and how hard you're working now to make sure that sort of normal trade of goods and services returns as soon as possible. Also very good to hear as well some of the examples you gave, and how that this, I really enjoyed as well that you said, you know, the moment is now, and that this is an opportunity now for the new agenda to really take over. So thank you so much, and there will be a lot more questions for you coming forward. Thank you again. So our third speaker today is also representing a fast country, and also New Zealand is a member of one of the founding members, as were Costa Rica, of the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform Group. New Zealand will be known to many of you as well for their commitment and their leadership to push sustainable and open trade solutions. Mike Webb is with us from New Zealand today. He's based here as a first secretary in the New Zealand mission to the WTO. And today he will be speaking to the issue of fossil fuel subsidy reform, and will also, I think, give us a little bit more details on the 6-country ACCTS, the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, that Anna just introduced us to as well. So Mike, the screen is yours.
Thank you for that introduction, Peter. In addition to its catastrophic health and social effects, COVID-19 has drastically changed the policy landscape of the energy sector. Global oil prices are at historic lows. Significant fiscal stimulus packages are being implemented to support recovery, and these packages provide an opportunity to support cleaner energy and reduce support for consumption of fossil fuels through a green recovery. However, without a focus on green recovery, fiscal stimulus packages may further entrench fossil fuel production and even increase production support due to low oil prices. I'd therefore like to take this opportunity to update you on how New Zealand and other WTO members, such as Costa Rica, Switzerland, and Norway, to name just but a few, are proposing to use trade frameworks as a tool to support fossil fuel subsidy reform. As a starting point, subsidies make greenhouse gas emitting fuels cheaper to produce and buy, acting as an incentive to use and produce more. Countries around the world were subsidising fossil fuel production and consumption to the tune of over 500 billion annually. While decreases in energy demand this year are likely to reduce consumption subsidies, it is important that countries embed this progress rather than backsliding on reforms, as we've already seen in the past when oil prices have started increasing again. Fossil fuel subsidy reform is not a new issue. The G20 and APEC members committed to action on this issue in 2009. Since then, they and others, such as the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, the V20, Pacific Island Forum leaders, and the G7 have issued statements calling for the phase-out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. In 2015, leaders from all UN member countries endorsed the need for fossil fuel subsidy reform and Sustainable Development Goal 12C. And the UN Secretary General has continuously highlighted fossil fuel subsidy reform as a priority issue for addressing climate change, including at the 2019 Climate Summit in New York. It remains the case that without addressing the issue of fossil fuel use, we won't be able to reach the goals set out in the Paris Agreement. While COVID-19 will lead to an unprecedented and unexpected economic downturn for 2020, recovery from the crisis in due course also presents an opportunity for countries to implement a green recovery. During the recent Petersburg Climate Dialogue, the IMF Managing Director pointed to fossil fuel subsidy reform and carbon pricing as priority areas of work for implementing a green recovery. Reform of these subsidies provides a means to free up fiscal resources to support those that need the greatest support through the COVID recovery. We remain convinced that the trade community has an important and crucial role to play to support global efforts in addressing climate change. It was for this reason that in 2017, New Zealand and 11 other WTO members delivered a statement at the 11th WTO Ministerial Conference. The statement aims at encouraging the rationalisation and phase-out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption, specifically through beginning to discuss the issue at the WTO. The statement recognises that reform needs to take into account the specific needs and conditions of developing countries and minimise possible adverse impacts on development in a way that helps protect poor and affected communities. It's never been a one-size-fits-all approach. Prior to the COVID outbreak, New Zealand and other signatories were actively engaging with WTO members to renew that statement for delivery at the next Ministerial Council meeting. Our proposed approach included making explicit what we see as the key next step, sharing information and experiences at the WTO in order to develop a supported international setting for addressing these subsidies and to assist domestic reform. The sharing of information and experience is even more important following the COVID pandemic. Countries are launching stimulus packages of unprecedented size to assist the economic recovery. Governments are investing in infrastructure and supporting private investment, and also considering tax policies to assist all those affected by the economic consequences of the pandemic. In conjunction with low oil prices, this presents opportunities. With low oil prices, consumption subsidies will typically go down because of the difference between the higher international oil price and the lower domestic price would be next to nothing. This presents a window for reform, in particular of consumption subsidies. And reforming now would mean that as oil prices increase during the global economic recovery, the money that would have been spent on fossil fuel subsidies could be channeled to support other sectors, including those sectors that may still be suffering the consequences of the COVID pandemic, tourism industry, for example, or alternatively, to allow income taxes to be at lower levels. In supporting investment, sustainability should be considered alongside other important considerations, such as jobs. But as we heard from Ho, job creation and sustainability considerations are not mutually exclusive. And sharing information and experience will help us learn from what others might successfully have been doing and the synergies that might exist. As others have mentioned, in tandem with our efforts at the WTO, we're also working with Fiji, Costa Rica, Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland in negotiations on the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, or ACTS. This new initiative will use modern trade rules to support efforts to address climate change and improve sustainability. This will include binding disciplines to eliminate harmful fossil fuel subsidies, the first time that countries will make such binding commitments. The objective is to conclude negotiations on a set of disciplines and commitments as quickly as is feasible in the circumstances. So, in conclusion, to support a green recovery from the COVID pandemic, we should seize the reform opportunity to stop encouraging negative environmental outcomes. Incentives should align and support Paris Agreement goals. And this has been a key driver for our efforts on fossil fuel subsidy reform and remains the case. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And I think using the phrase "seize the opportunity," and I think that was something that came across from both Anna and Aiko Lim's interventions earlier, that there is a particular opportunity now. The window is open to some extent, but it's pretty clear it's not going to be open forever. And when we note from Ho Lim, him talking about $10 trillion of stimulus already being put into economies by some McKinsey figures, that flow can't go on forever, and it's happening very quickly. So if we as a community are looking to influence it, the time is really now. Also very important to hear about the ACCTS, and that you're going to be concluding a world first there amongst the 6 members of a binding agreement around fossil fuel subsidies, which I think will act as a very strong precedent and a very useful piece of text and evidence for others who are considering doing the same multilaterally or within their regional trade agreements or free trade agreements or whatever. And I think the other point I would bring from your intervention as well is how much potential subsidies have to free up fiscal resources. And of course, all governments around the world are going to be sort of desperate for extra money now and in the months and potentially years ahead. And the idea of reforming fossil fuel subsidies and perhaps also of increasing taxation on certain energy products is one that could be one of the best ways forward we have to generate more scarce public resources. So thank you again, Mike. Our 4th and final speaker today is Milena Sell. Milena is now working with Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund. Sitra is a highly effective and innovative organization. I encourage you all to, if you don't know them already, have a look at their website, get in touch with them. And they're at the forefront of thinking ideas on many topics. Milena is a senior specialist today on one of their key aims, the circular economy, and until recently as well was a representative of the Finnish government's trade team. And she will also be able to give us some views and reflections on Finland's national perspective as well. Milena, we're absolutely delighted you could join us today, and the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Peter, for organizing this useful seminar. And I'm very inspired by all of the speakers that have already spoken before me here. Mustafa at IISD has also promised to share my screen because I do have a presentation. Thank you so much for organizing that. So in my presentation now, I'll focus in particular on the circular economy and speak a little bit about Finland's pandemic responses, and then end up with a few pointers on possible ways forward at the WTO, and of course taking in very much what the speakers before me have also said. So if I could have the next slide, please, Mustafa. I'll start by just telling you a few words about Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund. We're a 50-year-old organization with the main aim of creating a new era of well-being. So building on the Nordic well-being model that's quite common across all of the Nordic countries. And of course, part of that entails well-being not only for Finland, but for the world as a whole. We're under the parliament, a think and do tank, and funded through our own endowment. Next slide, please. So as we've already heard today, we're facing multiple crises at the same time. I guess in addition to the pandemic and trade crises of some sort or other that we're seeing, I'd also just really like to emphasize that we have overshot our planetary boundaries, both in terms of climate, nature and biodiversity loss, and unsustainable use of natural resources. So what we need is absolutely international cooperation, and as we move into green recovery programs in many countries, the impact of these packages can also really be much greater if there is synergy and cooperation there. So next slide, please. A few words about the circular economy. I've sort of the 3 phases of moving from a linear economy to a circular economy. The current linear economy is really about a system where we take resources, we produce, we consume, and after that, it's all about waste. And a recycling economy is one step up. Already we're thinking about what happens at the end of life of products, and they can be reused or recycled in some way or the other. But the circular economy goes much beyond that. It's much more about the full life cycle it's upstream, it's product design. How can we design products that will last and that will ensure the efficiency of our economic systems, and products that can be repaired and that can be remanufactured, so that we just don't end up with all of that waste. As in this little picture here, there's just an ocean of waste from the linear economy. The recycling economy gets it one step further, but the circular economy is really about designing out waste. So next slide, please. And it's not only about waste, it's also about really inefficiency, which, thinking about it from a global trade perspective, is quite interesting, because we have our value chains across the globe that have become incredibly efficient, but inherent in all of this, we still have a lot of inefficiencies when it comes to material and energy use. Since our topic today is also quite a bit about climate change, it's interesting to note that 67% of global greenhouse gas emissions are directly related to material management. So this is something to take into account. We can't really address climate change without also addressing material use, and the circular economy then comes to fore as a solution. Next slide, please. The circular economy also provides a lot of new business models, and especially now in COVID times, when we're thinking about jobs, social inclusions, etc., it's important to note that there are other ways to build the economy through business models such as product life extension, or product as a service. We don't need to own everything, just like with libraries. It can be quite a good, well, libraries are of course a free public good, but a lot of the things we use, we don't need to own. And there's also the focus on renewability and other resources than fossil, and on resource efficiency, recycling, etc. So there's clearly a jobs potential inherent in the circular economy. Next slide, please. So in terms of just what sorts of way we have to go forward, the COVID crises and how we build back will be very much about also continuing to focus on the green economy and green transition. And it's something that we're seeing today in a lot of places. And next slide, please. And then we can hop next to the next slide as well. Just a few instructive pictures here. Again, the next one, please. So in the EU, there's been a bit, there was the great big meeting about recovery measures yesterday, when the Commission came out with a recovery plan worth 750 billion euros. And again, hopping to the next slide after this, we have a tweet from Ursula von der Leyen, in which she clearly is stating that the next generation EU recovery plan will be green, it will be digital, and it will be resilient. So not backing away from these important priorities. Next slide, please. And Sitra has also been looking specifically at the Finnish context and how to move towards a sustainable recovery. Next slide, please. That can be found on our website, but really the focus can be on, as we've already heard today, on different levels and in different areas. But there's definitely is the whole clean physical infrastructure building up. There's the sustainable energy sector. There's the building efficiency, retrofitting inefficient energy, inefficient buildings. And of course, there's education, training, and R&D for clean projects. In Finland, the decision hasn't been made yet. The work is still ongoing on green recovery, but it will also be phased. Sort of the most acute phase then the medium term and the longer term projects. But with the current government, the focus is very much on ensuring that all recovery will be compatible with the commitment of Finland to go carbon neutral by 2030 and not lose sight of these priorities. And the working group under the Minister of the Environment has also set up a group looking specifically at green recovery and at sort of an indicator system for recovery measures in general to ensure that they don't go against goals related to climate, nature, and biodiversity, as well as material use. So next slide, please. Here, I'll be going through just a few ideas for trade policy options. And it's interesting because this slide looks a bit different on your screen than it did on my screen. But so the first point, which has been brought up earlier as well, is about continuing and strengthening dialogue and information sharing at the CTE, which has been so active, especially over the past year and a half, with countries of all kinds coming together around circular economy, a lot of side events, and really important here too, especially thinking circular economy and how circular economy focuses on the design phase of products, is the ongoing dialogue with standard setting organizations such as the ISO, or for example, the customs, the World Customs Organization, to think about how these are designed. Next slide, please. So, as been mentioned before, there's been so much momentum on a statement at MC12, and now that more focus starts coming onto WTO reform and the future of the WTO, this is also something to keep in mind. Next slide, please. The issue of liberalizing trade in environmental goods and services has also been brought up. And of course, it's kind of a never-ending story and saga, but for sure, as was mentioned by Ho Lim and others, it might be even more important than ever before now. And the work that's been done over many years is useful, but it's also an area that's moving incredibly fast. And what about new circular economy solutions, especially driven by digitalization and servicification of the economy? Next slide, please. Developing countries that are being incredibly hard hit by COVID have also been very active in the circular economy space, and there's definitely a need to think through some of the priorities here for developing countries for aid for trade, how aid for trade could be better aligned with ODA, and how to get solutions that are homegrown in developing countries up to international markets. Next slide, please. As New Zealand and Mike has been pointing out, fossil fuel subsidy reform is a key issue, and now with low energy prices or low oil prices, there's that momentum there too. Fishery subsidies are another example linked of environmentally harmful subsidies, and there are other out there affecting biodiversity, or just how do we price virgin natural resources if we're moving towards a circular economy. And after looking at direct subsidies, the next step, of course, is to look at taxation. And the day when we start paying the bills of all of the stimulus programs now, that money needs to come from somewhere, and it will come through taxation to quite an extent. And Sitra has been doing work on environmental tax reform for Finland, which points out exactly the sort of measures that we need to take related to moving taxes from labor or capital towards environmentally harmful activities and externalities. And so, final slide, if I could get that. Just as Mike was talking about New Zealand's excellent initiative on a treaty, a new treaty that will pull together a lot of what we need in order to move towards a sustainable trade system. That's very much something that we at CITRA support as well. And I'd just also like to throw in carbon pricing, a global price for carbon in all of this. So to wrap up, at this point, there are a lot of big movements going on, a lot of changes happening because of the multiple crises, but there are also a lot of opportunities. And one of them is for sure the green recovery money that will come in and how its utilization can be built so that we have synergies, and synergies that also at the global trading system can support so that we get the maximum benefit in terms of green global markets and transition and opportunities for developing countries and all other countries. So thanks, I'll stop there for now.
Rise to shine. Thank you so much, Malena. Again, full of good ideas. I really like the summation at the end as well, that now again is the opportunity. Very interesting to hear that you think aiming for a new agreement to cut to the heart of the sustainability crisis is a potential option. Good to hear some of the specific ideas as well, particularly in the trade space around aid for trade, environmental goods and services again, and improving the statement at the MC12 and pushing on that. And then interesting to hear about how Finland and the EU bloc more widely have been able to continue their focus on sustainability as a major part of their development plan going forward, despite the crisis. And it seems, from IISD's reflections as well, that those countries who already had frameworks in place and strong policies in place have been able to continue those. Those who haven't had those have been more trying to make things up a little bit more from scratch, and how we can help influence them to take the path that others are taking will be a key part going forward. So we're now into the second part of the webinar. I mean, one of my, we've done so many webinars, been on so many webinars recently, and we've organized so many as well. And you often hear at the beginning of webinars, we will leave plenty of time for questions, and they never do. Well, today we have left plenty of time for questions. We've had quite a few come into the chat box as well, into the Q&A box, let me get that right, and we'll deal with some of those. One of those was from Lydia El Bouzati, who asked whether there would be a recording of this webinar available. There will be, as long as we get permission from all of the speakers afterwards, and please look at the GSI website, www.isd.org/GSI, or at Global Subsidies for details on that. But without further ado, I'd now like to introduce my colleague Alice Tipping. She's the lead at IISD for our fisheries subsidies work. I hope you don't feel offended, Alice, if I describe you as a veteran of that issue and of trade and sustainable development issues more generally. And we're very pleased that she'll be moderating the discussion for us now. Alice, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Can everybody hear me? Yes, nods, good. Thank you very much indeed for the introduction, Peter. I'm going to be facilitating the Q&A part of this webinar. And as Peter has said, we have time. We haven't got a lot of time though. So I have been working diligently, collecting all of the questions that we've had in the Q&A and allocating them to speakers as we've gone along. So given that we probably have about 25 minutes or so, I'd encourage you, if you have any burning questions, to please put them into the Q&A at this point so that I can start allocating as many of them as I can to the speakers. And then we're going to have one specific discussant from Carlos van der Loo, who I can see from the Canadian Mission, and then I'm going to go to each of the speakers in rapid succession. So please be warned to answer as many of the questions as we've had come in for the Q&A as possible, leaving enough time for Peter to do some wrap up at the very end before 5:30 Geneva time. So first we have one specific discussant who we've invited to provide some thoughts in reaction to some of the presentations today, and that's Carlos van der Loo, who of course was the first secretary at the Canadian Mission to the WTO here in Geneva. So Carlos, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Alice. Can everybody hear me? Perfect. And thank you to Peter and the IISD team for organizing today's important discussion. I am keen to get to the Q&A session, so I will be brief. It's actually a rather easy job I have because there's very little that I disagree with, if anything, with the previous speakers. I think they all did a very fine job in laying out the imperative of addressing trade and climate change and the opportunity that we have today as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The seize the moment mantra, I think, came through a few times, and I think that really has to be the guiding principle over the course of our work over the coming months and years. I'm just going to share a cartoon that I've found rather telling and an important sort of context. If I can get, I can't share my screen, unfortunately. Maybe Mustafa can help me, can enable that function for me in a second. But let me just be very, very brief. As Ho said, the challenge is, how do we help ensure that the trade and climate change issue remains at the forefront of our work going forward as countries begin to focus on the economic recovery? We've heard a lot of countries talk about enabling sustainable and resilient recoveries from the pandemic, the economic shock. How do we ensure that sustainability includes environmental sustainability, not just economic sustainability, right? That's the question I think that we're grappling with here, and it's a tough one. I think one of the other lessons, and Anna referenced this in her presentation, is the importance of international cooperation and coordination in response to the pandemic, right? This is a global issue, and we're only going to be able to get out of this with global cooperation. And I think it'd be interesting to see what kind of lessons learned we can take from that and apply to the trade and climate change debate. We've seen in the course of the pandemic, the negative impacts, what happens when we don't have coordination, as well as positive impacts when we do have coordination. So how can we take those lessons learned and apply them to the trade and climate change issue? I think the speakers, laid out a number of areas. I'm just looking through my notes here of where work can happen, right? And there's no shortage of it. We've got fossil fuel subsidy reform, there's circular economy. We have the efforts of the FAST group in order to help create a forum, an area of discussion within the WTO on these issues, right? And to really help engender meaningful discussions within the WTO amongst the membership on trade and sustainability issues. And there's no shortage of issues that can be discussed. I think one of the key issues we have to keep in mind is every country approaches issues from a different perspective, has different capacity, resource capacity issues, as well as interests. And I think what we're trying to do in the FAST group, and I think Anna alluded to this, is to make sure that we don't create a one-size-fits-all approach, right? There really has to be something for everybody, and you can't say, if you don't do this, you can't do that. You really have to create that open space for these discussions to happen. And I think that's what we're really trying to do through the FAST group. I think that's really important, especially for developing countries who really have specific interests in relation to trade and sustainability, but also have real resource implications, limitations. So how do you really, how do you help them engage in these discussions in a meaningful way? And I think, this was also alluded to by Ho, in these are my words, the WTO is going through a crisis of legitimacy, right? It's been years since we've really been able to deliver meaningful outcomes. And as people are looking to the WTO to deliver outcomes in relation to the COVID pandemic recovery, right? What can the WTO do to support the economic recovery from the pandemic? What can the WTO do to help the world prepare for future human health crises? But I think part of the expectations of stakeholders going forward is, as these response measures are developed, they will want to see environmental sustainability reflected in a meaningful way, right? If the WTO wants to be a legitimate, relevant organization in the 21st century, it has to reflect those 21st century expectations. And I think that's a challenge for all WTO members to keep in mind going forward. And it won't be easy, let's be honest, right? And this is, I'm not trying to suggest that this will be an easy conversation. It won't be, but I think it really speaks to the scope and breadth of what we're facing here as a membership. So let me just very quickly sort of outlined 3 elements, I think, where work can be done or should happen. I think, first of all, it's important to continue discussions in forums like this, right? Bringing people together virtually to continue sharing ideas. And that's key. Until we can get back to face-to-face meetings at the WTO, we need to continue discussions in these forums. That's key. And, again, the second item would be to continue the discussions and the efforts that numerous groups of members are pursuing. So we have the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, we've got circular economy, we have the ACCTS. I mean, these kind of initiatives are also very important and useful in building comfort with issues and building analysis and understanding will help feed into future discussions. And then finally, just again, to go back to the FAST group, it really, as his host said, bringing the discussions into the CTE, into other bodies at the WTO in a meaningful way, and having discussions within members about what the WTO's contribution can be to trade and sustainability, trade and climate change. So there's no shortage of options. We have to keep in mind the WTO only moves as fast as its members want. So it's up to us as the like-minded to continue pushing and to continue working in unison to make sure that these priorities are addressed. So like I said, I want to leave enough time for a robust question and answer period. So I will stop there and look forward to hearing from people and questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Carlos. And I thought the 3 points at the end were particularly interesting, so I hope that we can record those and come back to them. I have a large selection of questions, and I'm actually just going to cheat and ask Peter, how far over 5:30 do you want us to go, or do you want us to stop smack on 5:30? You're the boss.
I'll give you 5 minutes.
Okay. So I'll ask the speakers to be particularly quick. And first, perhaps, Aiko, I had 2 quite specific questions for you on the WTO's measurements of trade and the pandemic, and then a broader question about the relationship between the WTO and trade and environment. So the first 2 specific questions that have come in the Q&A, and the first is, to what extent can the decline in the total value of world trade prior to the COVID-19 crisis be attributed to the declining prices of fossil fuels? And this, the speaker suggests, is an effect that often seems to get ignored when people talk about declining world trade. So a question for you there, asking you to be the WTO's chief economist for a moment. And then the other question is, does the WTO monitor how much trade in goods essential for human well-being versus luxury or non-essential items have been impacted? I assume the answer to that is yes, you look at kind of world trade, whether essential or non-essential, but if there's any distinction there, that would be interesting. So those are the 2 very technical questions. And the broader one is, can you offer some thoughts about the linkage between the WTO's work on trade and environment and perhaps some of the UNFCCC related work on response measures, which is a space where trade gets discussed, or perhaps just the overall integration of the UNFCCC and the WTO agenda? So 2 very technical questions, and then a broad comment on the interaction between the WTO and the UNFCCC agenda. Aiko?
No, thanks very much, Alice. On the 2 technical questions, I think the WTO chief economist and statistician would be horrified that I say anything about this, but anyway, I'll give it a stab. Well, yes, clearly fuels and food make up a very big part of global trade. So a fall in the oil price or fuel price will, of course, have an impact on the statistics and what we see in international trade figures. That being said, I was just thinking back to 2007, 2008, when we had a financial crisis. WTO did a similar forecast. We do these forecasts all the time. And we also predicted big drops in international trade. At the same time, in 2008, there was also a big drop in the oil price. Some of you are more expert on this than I am, like Peter, for instance. But I believe the oil price dropped by some 60%. The WTO forecast on trade for 2009 was like a 9% drop. In the end, it was something like a 12% drop in 2009. Now, when we look at 2020 and the COVID-19 effect, the predictions are something going up to about 32% drop in international trade. And I think that's a conservative estimate. I don't think the WTO economists necessarily, were trying to push the figures. But so what I'm trying to say is that even if you take into account the oil price, and yes, the oil price has dropped and it would be reflected in international trade figures as well, it seems to me, I can only say it seems because I don't study these figures, seems to me that what we're looking at reflects more than just an oil price drop. So I think there's more going on than just the oil price. In terms of luxury versus non-essential, to be honest, I would have to check, but I'm pretty sure that we don't make such a distinction. We don't make distinctions between what is luxury and what is essential and what is non-essential. When it comes to goods trade, we basically follow the harmonized system classifications, which have more to do with the good itself, the characteristics of the good, rather than whether you consider them to be luxury or non-essential. I think such a determination would make it very difficult for trade statistics and for trade statisticians to actually do. If we just look at goods, they already had quite a hard time figuring out environmental goods. So those are on the technical part. UNFCCC, WTO, we do collaborate and we do work with UNFCCC, and we have been participating directly in the UNFCCC body that deals with response measures. But I think that relationship, you need to look at it in two parts. That's the WTO Secretariat being at the UNFCCC. What I think people want is more an interaction between the member states of UNFCCC and the WTO member governments. They're often the same people, but yet it's, well, the same governments, let's say, not the same people. Yet getting that sort of cross discussion has been very difficult. And I don't have an answer to it. I can just say that on the secretariat level, we collaborate, we share, we do technical assistance. They are invited to the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment. They provide the updates, etc. But that's quite different from the sort of policy discussion about response measures, trade and climate change. Back to the membership, I'm afraid, on that one.
Fair enough. Okay, well, I won't put exactly the same question to the members, but if any of them would like to chip in with a bit of a response, a discussion on response measures, particularly under the UNFCCC framework, that would be interesting. Anna, there are a couple of questions for you. One is difficult, and one I hope is slightly easier. One that's come in relates more to investor protection in trade agreements, and the questioner notes that investor protection in trade agreements can be used to try and lock in fossil fuel production, as Costa Rica witnessed when it put in place a moratorium on oil extraction some years ago, and then was challenged by the company that lost its business as a result of that moratorium. And the question notes that getting onto a Paris-compatible path will likely affect many other fossil fuel investors globally. So I wondered if perhaps, kind of as a result of your government's experience, if you're able to speak about it, or if you had any broad sense of what the current thinking is about how we can arrive at a prioritization of climate, potentially over or delicately balanced with the interests of fossil fuel investors in trade agreements or otherwise. So that's the sort of the more investment focused question. And then the other question which has come in, if I can paraphrase it slightly, was, and perhaps it would be interesting to hear Costa Rica's perspective about whether the current situation in the pandemic has at all changed thinking in your government around nationally determined contributions that might be made under the Paris Agreement, and if there's some thinking around adjusting those or changing their direction or any changes at all. So a question on investment, and a question perhaps on specifically on the pandemic and its influence, if any, on nationally determined contributions.
Thank you, Alice. Actually, I wasn't very clear on the dynamic, and I went ahead and typed quickly my answers when I saw, but I apologize if I overstepped. I'd be glad to answer again to everyone. Regarding your first question on investment, well, Costa Rica made a choice in its economic model, and we have included environment and trade chapters in our FTAs for quite some time already. So for us, it's more than a plus, it's an asset rather than a conflict of interest. It is clear that we chose the path of sustainability. So fossil fuel extraction and oil exploration is not part of that. That is very, very evident in our policies. And what our FTAs do is reaffirm what other international commitments already establish. So we see this as two different things completely that should not have any conflict whatsoever. On your second question, we are, yes, we are taking actions internally as a result of the pandemic, but on the contrary, trying to facilitate trade as much as possible. Right now, as I mentioned in my intervention, we are having intense conversations with our Central American counterparts because I don't know if you are aware that borders have been closed throughout, well, in our northern border has been closed, and we have been having intense conversations to try and have them reopened. But our principal and main concern is the health and security of our population. So we have established intense protocols with health measures. We have been liaising with the private sector, and we have had trade facilitation at the core of this action, of this set of actions. Also trying in our efforts, trying to reactivate the economy, sustainability is always at the top of our list of priorities. We are looking into internal investment for reactivating the economy through construction, through the approval, hopefully soon, of the electric train. So we are looking into alternatives, sustainable alternatives that can give some kind of relief in the employment aspect of this crisis. And if I may, Alice, there was a third question addressed to me on plastics.
Yeah.
On plastic pollution. So very quickly, they asked me how we can reduce plastic pollution, basically. In a nutshell, I believe that what we need to do is make it less wasteful, more sustainable and circular. But mainly what we need is governments to push public policies for the production of recyclable or more biodegradable plastic. And this is the most suitable time for parliaments to push forward this kind of policies. Now, in a moment of crisis, is where we find opportunities to push ahead decisions and policies of this kind.
Super. Thank you very much indeed, Anna. And thank you for answering those sort of orally as well as in the Q&A, because I think it's helpful for visibility and for the rest of us to hear it too. Mike, there were a couple of questions that I thought I'd direct to you. And the first one was actually an interesting one about the subsidization of transport. And I wondered if this perhaps had come up in the Pacific context. So the question was, Ireland apparently is subsidizing ferry routes to France during the lockdown on the basis that they are essential for goods imports but uneconomic without passengers. Have you seen any similar justification for subsidization of transport links during COVID? And the question notes that with a future emphasis on security of supply of various products, medical products and food, such subsidies might become more permanent. And so I thought, given the geography of the Pacific, I wondered whether that was something you had come across. And then there were a couple of questions about the ACCTS, which of course everyone's interested in. And the first was a sort of a procedural question, and the other one's a substantive one. And the procedural one is, in fact, to any of the ACCTS negotiators, but I'll put it to you. The pandemic's clearly interfered with the original planned face-to-face negotiations. Have you been able, nonetheless, to begin them? And if not, is there a revised schedule for when they might begin? People would be interested to know. And the second question on the ACCTS is more substantive. Moving forward, how do you see the relationship between fossil fuel subsidy reform efforts and the ACCTS? So will sort of the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform continue to engage with the G20, APEC and the WTO while the ACCTS seeks to engage in binding subsidy rules? Or will the ACCTS complement the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform work in other ways as well? So transport, and then a couple of ACCTS related questions, if you would.
Great. Thank you, Alice, and thank you for those provided questions. Taking the first question about subsidisation of transport routes, we have seen really major disruptions to all sorts of transportation channels. It's been particularly pronounced in New Zealand, Australia Pacific, where we've seen a real decimation in airline capacity, including as a result of countries that are islands taking advantage of being an island to help in their own efforts to stamp out COVID. And that is having an impact. I think one thing people are discovering is just how much air freight is actually done in the belly of passenger jets, and that's having an impact. And there's been a range of different responses. For those that are interested in some details, the OECD is a very good policy tracker, as well as the Global Trade Alert, and that can give you a bit of sense of what countries are doing, and sort of what the scope might be, what's temporary, and what the space is. Turning to the two X questions, I guess I'll answer the more procedural one first. It's more straightforward. So yes, the pandemic has disrupted our plans to meet in person, because often that is how you negotiate for face-to-face. It's good to get a relationship with your counterparts. We're now working through virtual arrangements, hoping to be able to meet very soon, just working through logistical details, including things like time zones, which is something we're really finding in New Zealand. We're sort of transforming from the tyranny of distance to the tyranny of time zones. Anyone in New Zealand watching this is really keen, given it's gone about 3 o'clock in the morning right now. So just trying to work through those details. In terms of the substance and how what we're doing in X might complement what we're doing at the WTO on fossil fuel subsidy reform. With X, we're a small group of ambitious members that are ready to make ambitious commitments now. We think it's the right thing to do, that these rules will help better environmental outcomes. We are in some ways a pathfinder group. Now, the wider membership is not ready yet, so that's why at the WTO we're proposing to share information and experiences and sort of build knowledge and understanding. And then when the time is right, the membership will be able to look at what's been done in the smaller pathfinder agreements as templates or models that could perhaps be relevant in the multilateral context. And ultimately, we do see WTO as the place to be talking subsidies, which is also why we are prioritising the successful conclusion of fisheries subsidies negotiations as well. And then also there is a fossil fuel subsidy is being discussed in other forums such as G20. There's been some really useful peer reviews, and so we continue to work in those different places, looking at really the value added and niche of each different organisation and entity. Thank you.
Super, thank you very much, Mike. Malena, I collected, I guess, kind of 2 circular economy focused questions for you, and one that's sort of broader about green recovery plans. And I hope that perhaps your experience or Finland's experience might be useful here. And so the 2 specific circular economy questions, one was, when we talk about the fact that the economy should be more circular, do we mean locally, sort of within a sub-national area? Do we mean regionally, or do we mean globally? How is it thought about? So that's the conceptual circular economy question. The very technical circular economy question that's come in is, are you able to offer a prediction of the maximum resource efficiency of a circular economy? And can this figure be less than 100% to be effective? So if we are all, paraphrasing, if a circular economy is only 90% kind of resource effective? Is it still effective as a circular economy? So 2 circular economy questions. And then there were a couple of broader ones. One which I thought I might put to you. What advice can panelists offer national governments in designing green stimulus packages that address challenged areas in domestic sectors without hindering trade or the ability to meet international climate goals? And there was another one that related, I think, specifically to something that you mentioned, so I thought I'd come back to it because it was very interesting. Should the green recovery come with downstream sectors or final consumer taxation, or should it discourage upstream sectors from their more destructive activities? Perhaps or both. So a conceptual and a technical circular economy question, and then a broader one about green recovery packages and how they're designed.
Thank you. So several broad questions, actually. I'm also actually trying to pull them out here in the list. How about yeah, go ahead.
Should I read the 2 circular economy ones again first for you to focus on?
Yeah,
okay, sure, there's a long list. So the first was, when we mention that the economy should be more circular, do we mean circular locally, so within a state, or regionally or globally? And the second one was, can you offer a prediction of the maximum resource efficiency of a circular economy? And can that figure be less than 100% and still be effective?
Great, thanks. So first to the one on what level we're looking at when we're talking about a circular economy. And my answer to that would be that we can look at many levels at the same time. And especially in Finland, when we've drawn up our National Circular Economy Action Plan, there's been a lot of focus on what can be done at the municipal level, at the city level, and sort of closer, more closed loops and cycles there. But that doesn't mean that we wouldn't also be operating at many levels and at wider economic levels at the same time. And especially, this is especially interesting when it comes to global trade, because there is sort of one set of circular economy thinkers who would prefer really to keep loops close and closed and more local or regional. But at the same time, the reality is that we're operating in a global economy, and we are absolutely linked through global value chains. And so what we're seeing is that the resources we use, the services, the ideas, data, etc., is already in global circulation, and that really would be the bigger picture for the circular economy. That doesn't mean that we couldn't, bring home part of those or engage also in more local economic systems, but in order to have a global circular economy transition, we'll definitely need to also look at that global level of the circular economy. And that's why I think it's so inspiring to have the discussions at the CT and at the WTO and to move ahead in that direction. And yeah. And then there was the issue of resource efficiency, which is something that I haven't looked at specifically as such, because there's also the resource efficiency coupled discussion about resource throughput and resource use in general. It's interesting because when the EU went through there and creating this new circular economy action plan, there was also at some point in the discussion, there was the idea of setting a goal for sort of absolute throughput and decoupling, but that was possibly for political reasons or for other reasons that was dropped at some point. So that's a good issue to continue thinking about. Also about the absolute volume and how far you can get with resource efficiency or not.
Okay. And any advice you can offer on designing green stimulus packages, the $64 billion question, perhaps. And perhaps a couple of words, if you wouldn't mind expanding on this idea of whether green recovery packages should come with taxation focused on downstream sectors and final consumers, or discouraging upstream sectors from destructive activities, or both.
Well, some of the taxation parts, at least in Finland, is not something that's happening up front. First, it's more the directly stimulating part of the package, and then only afterwards, this opens up an opportunity for tax reform as well. So at that point, that will really be the time to look at upstream, downstream, but certainly building on the point that I was making earlier, just about how we use taxation and moving away more from labor and capital and more into environmental externalities. That also does move us upstream.
Super,
but
thank you very much.
Yeah, could be sort of in both places in a sense.
Yeah. See, that would seem to be logical. That's quite right. We've come to the very end. Just before I pass the floor to Peter, there was one other question that I thought was really interesting. So I'm going to, with your forgiveness, just throw it out to the panelists and all of us to think about, rather than having it specifically answered here. But I thought it was important enough to highlight. And the question is, in light of the fact that GDP is an inadequate measure of the economy and all that society values, and that, as quoted in the question, growth, regardless of the form it appears to take, does not enhance life satisfaction, alleviate poverty, or protect the environment, and that decoupling economic growth from carbon emissions seems to be impossible, the person asking the question was surprised to hear panelists talking about a high growth recovery formula through trade. So I thought the open question to leave for all of us, which was worth highlighting from this question, is what would a non-growth oriented trade agenda look like if it's different from what's being put forward? So a question perhaps for all of us to take away and think about. And with that, Peter, I might hand the floor back to you for some closing remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alice. That's an excellent question. And I think one thing that we haven't really focused on enough, perhaps on during the webinar today, although Anna did bring it up, was how the sort of decisions we're going to make locally and individually, and what we value in our lives, how is that going to be part of the new reality? We're not going to go back to the same as what we were before. And I think that question really sort of highlights that as well. Very quick summing up, if I may. Firstly, thank you very much to all our speakers today for giving their time and their expertise. So Ho, to Anna, to Mike, to Milena, to Carlos. I learned a huge amount today, and it was really interesting to hear your advice and how you framed the issues and how some of the specific suggestions that you came up with, and thanks for answering all the questions as well. I think we're faced at the moment, there is both an imperative to work on climate and environmental issues, and perhaps an opportunity. And I think one of the things that came across pretty strongly today as well is that opportunity may be quite time limited, at least in terms of stimulus packages. So now is the time, seize the moment. We had a lot of ideas today, what could be happening at the WTO. Thank you, Carlos, for summarizing those. Within individual sectors, nationally, local level, personal actions again, and also, as Milena was just talking about, on fiscal policy. What role is there to play for subsidy reform and taxation, and should that taxation be coming in later when the economy is re-stimulated and as part of a wider environmental fiscal reform package, as Nordic countries and others, Costa Rica and others, have put in place for many years going forward. Also, going right back to what Ho was saying at the beginning, the need for us all to be able to show convincingly to governments that green, clean, low impact investments, whatever we want to call them, will operate at least as well now and in the future as the more conventional, more brown alternatives, is clearly a strong imperative on all of us. And also very, very encouraging today as well to see this event as one of many that's been happening in the last couple of months, and even before that, about there being a sort of growing community coming together around these trade and environment issues. Anna and Carlos also hosted a session yesterday led by the FAST group, and again, very well attended, lots of enthusiasm, lots of energy. And I think a reflection of mine at present is it feels like we're all too small individually to have impact on the big issues that we're facing, and it's only really by acting in solidarity and working together that we're going to have an impact here. So I think we have an imperative, we have an opportunity, we need to seize the moment. We've got lots of good advice today on the specifics of how we might do that. We've got a community coming together. So I leave this webinar on a very, very positive outlook, and thank you all for your time and your attention today, and I look forward to speaking and working with you all very, very soon. Good evening, good day, good morning, good night.